Good afternoon. Kristina Štrkalj Despot is the Vice Director and a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Croatian Language and Linguistics. Her research interests include cognitive linguistics, figurative language, semantics, conceptualization, relationship between mind and language, e-lexicography, and historical linguistics. She has received 3 national awards for her work, as well as an international Fulbright postdoctoral award. She has been a fellow at Oxford University in 2009 and a Fulbright postdoctoral researcher at University of California, Berkeley during the academic year 2011-2012, with George Lakoff as her faculty sponsor. She has been a visiting scholar at University of California, Berkeley in 2016 with Yves Switzer as her faculty sponsor, as well as a visiting scholar on several other universities, including University of Amsterdam, University of Dublin, University of Mannheim, etc. She collaborated on a dozen of national philological projects and on the international project MetaNet, a multilingual metaphor repository at the International Computer Science Institute, Berkeley. She was a management committee member of the European Network of E-Lexicography Cost Action and the principal investigator of 2 externally funded projects: Croatian Metaphor Repository, funded by Croatian Science Foundation, and Semantic Role Labeling in Slovene and Croatian, funded by Bilateral Program. She is an author of 3 books and more than 40 academic papers. She is one of the editors of the book Metaphor and Metonymy in the Digital Age, John Benjamin's publishing company. Currently, she is the principal investigator of the project MetaNet HR, the project of building a lexical, semantic, and figurative language repository of the Croatian language. And I could go on and on, but I have to keep it shortly because we are all eager to hear what Kristina has to say to us. Kristina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michaela. Thank you for these nice words. And thank you all, of course, for coming at this quite late hour. I hope you're not too tired and that I'm not going to tire you even more. And I'm really thankful to the organizers for inviting me here today, because it is always a pleasure for me to share my enthusiasm and some new research insights that I have with my colleagues, so thank you. So, as you have probably already seen, the subject of and the topic of the talk that I'm going to give today is the embodied simulation and figurative thoughts in the construction of meaning. And my talk will be structured around 4 parts. In the first, let's say, introductory parts, I will try to present you different approaches to meaning. And of course, I'm not trying to give you an overview of the history of semantics. That would be quite impossible. But I would just give you some broader context to what I'm going to talk about later, so that you can see where the place of the theory that I'm going to present is among other similar or different approaches, perhaps. And then I will talk about simulation semantics. And this is the theory of meaning that I think is the best, or suited the best to describe really what this wonderful phenomenon as meaning actually is. And then in the third part, I will talk about how brain structures underpin symbolic meaning. So I will try to somehow complement the theory simulation semantics that I'm going to present with some new, really very recent insights from other fields, not from linguistics, that I think we should really take into account when making a plausible theory of meaning. And at least for me, these insights were really, really important and interesting, and I tried to incorporate those into my view of meaning, let's say, and I hope it will be interesting to you as well. And then on the end of the talk, I will talk about my project, MetaNet HR, the project of the Institute of Croatian Language and Linguistics, where I work. And I think that this project will nicely, practically show how all this complicated theory can be actually applied into linguistic research, mainly linguistic. So when we talk about different approaches to meaning, I will start with Raffaelli's basic differentiation between referential, anti-referential, mentalistic, anti-mentalistic, and usage-based approaches. So this referential approach is, of course, focused on the referent in the external world. So this is the basic concept within this approach. And it's the main proponents of this kind of approach to semantics is, for example, Ogden and Richards, componential analysis, cognitive linguistics as well, of course. And then we have this anti-referential view, mostly by structuralists and Saussure, for example, that view language as a very autonomous phenomenon, and that we are actually, as linguists, shouldn't look at anything else but language. And then this gives us this neat and tidy explanations and analysis that Dagmar was talking about, for example. And other proponents of this, for example, approach other than the Saussure is, of course, Martinet, Cocherillo, etc., and other structuralist approaches. And then we have these mentalistic approaches that are focused on the concept, so on this kind of mental category between the referent in the external world and the linguistic sign. And of course, this approach was propagated by, for example, pre-Bloomfield linguistics, and then, of course, cognitive linguistics definitely put this into a center of their attention. And then we have also anti-mentalistic approaches, for example, by Bloomfield and Martinet, who blamed these mentalistic views as being guilty for the fact that semantics is not as objective and as exact as it should be. So when we see all these different kind of approaches, the approach I'm going to talk about is referential, mentalistic, and usage-based. And this is kind of expected because the simulation semantics that I'm going to talk about is part of cognitive linguistics. So basically, referential, mentalistic, and usage-based are all approaches very typical of cognitive linguistics in general. And if we talk about some different approaches or methods used in describing meaning that you're probably very well acquainted with, like componential analysis, prototype and stereotype semantics, frame semantics, semantics within syntactic structures, different approaches there, as you can see. The simulation semantic approach largely is based on prototype and stereotype semantics and frame semantics, as you will see from what I'm going to talk about now. In this whole talk, I will, of course, follow the line of cognitive linguistic approaches to language, putting meaning in the center of the interest, of course. And these are some of the basic tenets of all cognitive approaches to language. And I'm not going to go through all of them now. But of course, what is really important is that semantics is based on speakers' construals of situations and not on objective truth conditions. And of course, that semantics and pragmatics form a continuum, and both play a role in linguistic meaning. And of course, this stereotype and prototype approach to meaning is very important within this framework. And that the primary function of language is to convey meaning. So this is kind of where this functional approaches really crucially differ from other more formal approaches to language. And the whole cognitive linguistics is based on cognitivism. It is kind of a new view of reason in comparison with Cartesian philosophy, for example, or dualistic approaches. Within the cognitivistic view of reason, reason is embodied, evolutionary, mostly unconscious, largely metaphorical, emotionally engaged, and limited by human conceptual system. So totally different from what we knew about reason before the cognitivistic era. And then from these views of reason arose main tenets of cognitive linguistic approaches to meaning, and that is that the mind is inherently embodied, that thought is mostly unconscious, and that abstract concepts are largely metaphorical. So the simulation semantics is a theory within the larger theory called neural theory of language and thought. And I like this theory exactly because it takes into account not only what we accomplished within linguistics, but also in neural science, neural computation as well, brain research, etc. So I think if we already have an opportunity to take into account these really well proven and experimentally validated facts, why shouldn't we take them into account? So the basic principles of neural theory of language and thought is that thought is structured neural activity, and that language is inextricable from thought and experience, and therefore from this neural activity as well. And within the neural NTLT, this importance of linguistic community is really, really high, and this will, of course, give us the reference to the main topic of the conference, so what is individual and what is collective in the meaning construction. Behind this embodiment and simulation hypothesis as being really important and crucial to meaning construction, there is this notion of embodied information processing. So within NTLT, of course, they do believe that some kind of information processing is really going on in our brains when we produce language. But of course, it's not that like just manipulations of formal symbols disembodied, like in the Chomskyan approaches, for example. So this kind of information processing is completely embodied. What does it mean? Well, it comes from the fact that the crucial property of our brain is its link to our body. Because brains evolved to control our bodies. And the dominant function of our brain is to connect sensation and action. So basically, we sense the world around us in order to act somehow. And our nervous system evolved for sensing and action. And the language is a very recent extra, evolutionary speaking. And it should come as no surprise that we use a lot of this pre-existing machinery in producing language, in understanding, in meaning construction, etc. So the idea of embodiment and simulation is actually not quite new, at least not in other areas than linguistics, because it's quite an old idea. It dates back to Wernicke already, and this is really a wonderful explanation of his stance on meaning, for example. As he wrote, the concept of the word bell is formed by the associated memory images of visual, textual, and auditory perceptions. And these memory images represent the essential characteristic features of the object bell. And this is really wonderful, and it's a pity that we were not aware of this really nice description of what meaning really involves, only until recently. And this, what Wernicke already knew, obviously a long time ago, was quite recently experimentally definitely validated and confirmed with discovery of mirror neurons by Rizzolatti and his colleagues. And what this discovery actually states is that the same neurons are activated when we execute actions and when we observe, imagine, dream, or talk of similar actions performed by others or by us. So it's the same neural architecture behind all these processes. And then what is a simulation actually? It's an ability to imagine our own and other actions, and that is the core of understanding. So if we are not able to imagine something, we are not able to understand the meaning of it. So understanding the meaning of words involves activating perceptual, motor, and affective experiences. And then this theory of simulation semantics is also very compatible with the theory of mental spaces, because we need mental spaces in order to simulate on a higher level, let's say. We know that we are in a discourse, for example, able to construct really, really complicated scenarios with multiple spaces, multiple times, multiple people in it, etc. We are even able to imagine ourselves in different parts of time, etc. So basis of the whole mental spaces theory is also embodied simulation hypothesis. What goes into meaning? It's primarily encyclopedic knowledge, as I already told, and then also our experience, individual background, and higher level pragmatic issues, of course. And for all this, we have really converging evidence from neuroscience, psychology, computation, neural computation, cognitive linguistics, etc. And all this leads us to hypothesize that really understanding really requires some kind of embodied simulation. So what would this actually mean practically? For example, to understand meaning of a word like antelope, for example, we need to activate all the conceptual knowledge we have about this, and also our experience with antelopes, if any, but also our knowledge about this. And of course, the experience and knowledge are both somehow entrenched in culture and also idiosyncratic in a way. So this is how it all works together. And of course, the different experiential histories we may have, and we all have different experiential histories, will lead and produce different capacities and tendencies to simulate. And this is actually, I think that this theory of embodied simulation is quite intuitive to us. At least to me, I didn't need any convincing that it's really true, because from our introspection, we somehow already knew that something like that is going on, because we have experienced having some kind of visual imagery and imagining things while trying to understand what is going on. So I think this is... So what goes into simulation? We have a linguistic input, a context, broader pragmatic context, and a narrow context of a sentence, and then also a world knowledge. But how actually linguistic input comes into this story? This linguistic input includes constructions, grammatical constructions, of course, then semantic frames, embodied schemas like executing schemas, force dynamic schemas, etc., and of course metaphor or figurative links between these things, and also mental spaces. And what's the role of grammar in it? Well, it is very well researched that actually it's nouns and verbs that contribute a content to be simulated. So nouns and verbs are really crucial. For example, if a toothbrush is mentioned in a sentence, we will, of course, either imagine an object, a referent, a toothbrush, or we will simulate an action of brushing our teeth. So what about grammar? It is called that grammar is kind of a second-order contribution to simulation, because it does not tell us what to simulate, but how to simulate it. So, for example, an active voice will increase our simulation from the perspective of agent, of course, and Dagmar showed us that this is really experimentally validated as well. And on the other hand, passive voice will increase our ability to simulate from the perspective of patient, of course. Everything what I told you so far is really easy when it refers to concrete objects, of course. Then it's quite easy to imagine what do we simulate, what kind of imagery we have in our minds when producing and trying to understand what is going about. But the problem and the big issue is, of course, with abstract concepts. So it's much harder to relate an abstract concept to a referent in the external world, of course. And this problem of abstract concepts has been dealt with in two ways. There is this view that abstract concepts are also grounded in perceptual and motor simulation, but of their use. So when we use these words, in which context, this is like really crucial for the conceptualization of abstract concepts. And then there is the other view, which is quite prevalent, and that is that abstract concepts are grounded metaphorically in concrete concepts. And this is, of course, this has started with Lakoff and Johnston as early as the 80s, and now is really neatly developed into a really nice neurally underpinned theory, which is called the neural theory of metaphor, also by Lakoff from 2006. And the central notion of this neural theory of metaphor is a notion of primary metaphor. And primary metaphors are, according to Grady, really widespread and probably universal, because we all as humans have same body and similar surroundings. And these primary metaphors are based on our early experiences that commonly occur together. I miss one slide, but you won't mind. For example, a very, very well-known example of primary metaphor is affection is warmth. And it is known that this primary metaphor arose from our early experiences. For example, being a baby and being affectionately held by our parents or close persons. Our brains simultaneously computed both affection as a more abstract domain and physical temperature as such. And this is really, really well entrenched in all languages that we know of so far, that emotions are kind of conceptualized by this primary metaphor. So nice emotions are warm, physically warm, and some bad emotions are usually cold. And these primary metaphors are actually based on a very well-known principle of learning, of neural learning that we all perform. And it's called the correlation learning principle. This principle states that neurons that fire together, wire together, and neurons out of sync, delink. This is exactly what I told about affection and warmth. So if two concepts are really constantly and very often activated together, then they get really strongly neurally connected among each other. And this is like the basic principle on which we humans learn everything, not just linguistic connections and conceptual connections, but basically how to function in the world. And this is nice because it tells us that learning does not add knowledge to an unchanging system, as was taught before, but it changes the whole system completely. So if we learn some new fact, our whole brain restructures. And also if we don't use certain connections that were there before, they will just die out. So this is kind of really a nice image. Oh, here is. So these are primary metaphors that are already well investigated in mostly in English, but in other languages as well. Now to kind of round up this whole mainly linguistic story, I will just repeat what are the main ingredients that contribute to meaning, according to my opinion and these theories that I have presented. So it's definitely embodiment, then our shared experience, which is collective, let's say, then individual experience, as I have shown, then prototypes and radial categories, simulation semantics, image schemas, primarily X schemas and force dynamic schemas, semantic frames, conceptual metaphors and metonymies, cultural narratives, blends, especially mental spaces, of course, and also grammatical and lexical constructions. And a major role is, of course, also in the pragmatic functions of meaning. And now I will try to somehow broaden this horizon with some new insights that I recently gained. And I will actually present you some really new discoveries that I came up really accidentally, namely with my dear colleague Anita Petistantic, that you all know. We visited MIT in December, and she took me to this talk like totally accidentally, and I've never heard before of this magnificent researcher, young one, Ev Fedorenko. So we were there at MIT, you know that's the temple of Chomsky, that's his home basically. And she was talking, I mean, we were really, really amazed, like, is this real? Do we really hear this? Because she was talking about how all the research she has done leads her to the conclusion that the meaning is definitely the primary driver of the language as a whole. So this is the slide, this is the photo of the slide I took there. And it's probably not so visible because it's just my phone. But you can see how amazing these results are, especially how amazing it is to hear these kind of things at MIT. So I would say the new era has obviously come, and our linguistic wars might finally end, hopefully. So what she has proven is that brain regions that support language processing are selective for language. That's the first conclusion. So there were some dispute that The brain regions might support other cognitive abilities as well, and that they are not like specialized for language, but she has finally proven that there is definitely a brain region that is kind of a language network and selective for language. And then the second really extraordinary discovery is that brain regions that support word meanings versus syntactic processing are the same. So there is definitely no single brain region that supports exclusively syntactic information, as Chomsky believed. So each region in the language network is sensitive to both lexical and combinatorial information. And then the third discovery is that the primary driver of the language region's responses is semantic composition. That was really nice to hear for somebody coming from a cognitive background as I am. And now I will talk about some other approaches that I also recently discovered. And that's the work by Paul Vermilla. And it is really, it was also really interesting to me because I think it really nicely complements everything that I was talking about and kind of gives answers to the questions that we were not sure how it actually works. So he did a really wealth of research on using brain imaging, patient studies, neurocomputational research, etc. And all the research, all the results of his research definitely support semantic grounding and meaning embodiment in sensory and motor systems. So it is definitely a validation for the embodied simulation hypothesis that I presented earlier. But what was really puzzling for me about his theory is that he showed how neuronal and cognitive mechanisms for concrete and abstract meaning are completely different. So this is something new because within previous theories we have seen that we are somehow trying to put it in the same bucket, let's say, and maybe try to say, okay, abstract concepts are really hard, but we might understand them using figurative links to some really primarily embodied experiences. But in this new research from Paul Vermilla, it is actually shown in the detail how this processing, our processing of abstract and concrete, really crucially differs. So we use completely different neuronal mechanisms to think abstractly and to think about concrete objects. So he differs between referential semantics, combinatorial semantics, emotional affective semantics, and abstract semantics. And here on the left side, like referential and emotional semantics, is thought to be like primary grounded. So it's primarily grounded in our embodied experience. But we have this right side of combinatorial and abstract semantics that are not grounded, like they are secondary grounding, because they are not directly grounded in embodied experience, but not indirectly, let's say. So referential semantics is what I was talking about at the beginning of the talk, actually basically neuronal link between a linguistic sign, a word, and a referent from the external world. So a toothbrush, a word, and all our experiences with toothbrushes we have so ever. So this is this neuronal link, and it is also formed based on that correlation learning principle that I was talking about before. And of course, this is really strongly and oftenly activated together. So this link between this kind of word and an objective referent from the external world is really, really strong. Then we have emotional affective links in our brain, and that's basically a link for an emotional affective word and our internal states. And it is also very, of course, primarily embodied. And the combinatorial semantics is actually our ability to learn symbolic meaning from context, from purely linguistic context. And this is something that has been completely regarded in all these theories so far, because we are really able not to learn only from the external world, but we are primarily learning through language. So this is, I think, really, really nice complement. And then also abstract semantics is actually generalizing over a range of instances. So they have shown that Abstract concepts also actually tend to somehow be entrenched into embodied experiences. So it often happens that we understand abstract concepts very similar to this emotional affective side. Because we tend to ascribe certain emotional meaning to abstract concepts like freedom and other, let's say, important abstract concepts. And then they are processed like they are primarily embodied, like the emotional affective semantics. But then there are really like hard examples like beauty and game, and there something completely different happens. So what does it happen? We have this concrete meaning, for example, for the concrete word I. And as you can see, our brain constantly gets these similar instantiations of I. And you can see that semantic features of I really strongly overlap. And since this happens very often, links are really, really strong between the word I and its instantiations in the external world. But what this second case is the case of beauty. What with beauty? We have this abstract meaning of beauty, and what we get, what our mind gets, is these really dissimilar instantiations, very, very different from each other. And they exhibit something more like a family resemblance pattern, let's say in Wittgensteinian sense. Even if that, I don't know, maybe nothing. So this results with really, really weak links to the symbol, to the verbal symbol for these instantiations. So with concrete meanings, we have these strong links, and with abstract meaning, we have these really, really weak links, and also we need to have this ability to generalize, like what beauty is actually from all these different instantiations. And we are really able to do that, like to extract what beauty is actually from these different instantiations. Really, there is a great variability of what goes into meaning of abstract concepts. Yes, so that's the theoretical part, and I hope it was as exciting to you as it was for me to kind of put this into a unified picture. And now I will try to show you how we have actually applied this really complex theory into building a linguistic repository or semantic repository. So our project is MetaNet HR, and these are collaborators. So it is basically a project of building a repository of semantic frames, image schemas, conceptual metaphors, and hold the connections between these phenomena. So everything I was talking about, we are trying to put into a database. And the project is a sister project to the UC Berkeley and International Computer Science Institute MetaNet that I've been working on also. And we combine a theory-driven introspective top-down approach with a bottom-up corpus-based approach. So this theory is largely taken from MetaNet project, from the Berkeley one. And then this bottom-up corpus-based approach is our original contribution that we are kind of proud of, that we have developed really a nice method to perform a corpus-based conceptual analysis. And I will talk about this method a bit later. So as I said, this is a figurative language database, or maybe just, let's say, language database, and it lists conceptual metaphors and metonymies decomposed into source-target relations among cognitive primitives, image schemas, semantic frames, and then semantic frames are further decomposed into semantic roles. Project involves this cognitive linguistic research, but also computational linguistic research and psychological experiments, primarily for these primary metaphors, because those experiments are quite popular when we are trying to really see whether this connection between sources and targets of primary metaphor are really unconsciously there, even when we are not aware of them. And there is really a wealth of these experiments, but we also perform some experiments within our project. And the main result is this database that you can freely access on this web page. And this is how it looks like. So it lists metaphors, conceptual metaphors. You can click on every single of these metaphors and get the more detailed description of the metaphor. And also semantic frames, hierarchies of metaphors, hierarchies of semantic frames, etc. So the database is quite detailed, so we are not only giving a list that would be, well, maybe a bit useful but not interesting at all. So we are really filling this data with this really refined analysis of each of these occurrences in the corpus. And then for each metaphor we give like to which family it belongs, so what are the superordinated metaphors to the one in question. And also we are giving information on the type of the metaphor, whether it is primary or complex or entailed, what is the level of it, how general it is, how specific it is. And then, so basically for each metaphor we give its type, family, level, source frame, target frame, mappings involved in this metaphor, relations and type of relations. And these are possible type of relations. And the inspiration for this approach was the sentence from the Neural Theory of Language and Thought that states that mental structure parallels active neural structures, and that connected concepts are neurally connected, as we have seen on the basis of this correlation learning principle. So we kind of wanted to go other way around. So what can we get from linguistic data? What is connected, obviously through language, and then we believe that by drawing a map of connected concepts and deconstructed complex metaphorical expressions, we are actually drawing the map of our minds. So we were, of course, interested into then which concepts are actually connected through linguistic instantiations of conceptual metaphors. And that's why we developed this method for metaphorical conceptualization analysis, which is completely language specific. So we really wanted to make it language specific because the whole field of metaphor research is really heavily dominated by research done in English, probably linguistics in general is. We have developed this method that we first, of course, choose the metaphor family we are going to analyze, and then create a list of target words for which we will query the corpus for. And we use word sketches and thesaurus in word sketches to elicit these words that are really also language specific. So these are words that are really frequent in the corpus of the Croatian language. And then we perform a linguistic metaphor identification and annotation procedure using the MIPFL method. And we perform this analysis on the sample of the 300 concordances from the two corpora, from Hrvatsko and our institute's corpus, Jezična riznica, which is now also available in Sketch Engine. And it gives us really, really nice, completely different data from these two corpora. So it is really important to use both. And we also perform conceptual metaphor identification. It is a hard task. It is always, when you are dealing with concepts, you never know. So we are using at least 2 annotators, and we are trying to measure IAA as well, inter-annotator agreement, and then we discuss the problematic cases all together. And these are, for example, the families we have here on the left side. You can see the families of metaphors we have processed so far. Not entirely, of course, but they are there. So we have emotion metaphors, different emotion metaphors, then event structure, mind metaphors, morality, ontological, orientational, primary metaphors, psychological, etc. And this is kind of thesaurus from the Sketch Engine that you would get, for example, for the word jealousy in Croatian, and from this we would extract the words that are we going to use to query the corpus for, and to get the whole really, let's say, a true linguistic picture as it's reflected in the corpus of how in the Croatian language a certain emotion is conceptualized actually. So these are some really interesting experiments. They have been also disputed, but they are really, really cited quite often. And these are the experiments that I was talking about that are trying to see whether the neural connection between sources and targets of primary metaphors is really cognitively real, let's say, even if we are not aware of this. So, for example, this first experiment, what they did is that they asked their participants to imagine a person. So nothing else, just imagine a person and describe the person to us. And what participants didn't know, because when they were entering the room, they each got a cup of coffee before, but the one half of the participants got the warm coffee and the other part got the cold coffee. So, and results shown that people who were holding a cold cup of coffee actually described this imaginary person in a quite bad way, so as being a cold, distant, whatever. And the half of the participants that were holding this warm cup of coffee were, of course, describing a warm, friendly person, etc. So, as you can see, it's published in Science, so it must be true. And all these other experiments are really interesting in a similar way, also exploring, for example, this cold and lonely. People were asked to either remember a situation when they were socially rejected and felt really bad, and then the other half was asked to imagine or to remember a situation when they felt really nice, when they were socially accepted, and afterwards they were asked to judge a room temperature. So the people with cold memories judged the room to be several degrees lower than people with warm memories. So based on these experiments, we have also performed several experiments, but this one is already accepted. It's going to be published in a Metaphor and Social World quite soon. So I will just present this one really briefly. So what we try to do is to see whether the connection between difficulty and heavy is also as well entrenched, because this is also primary metaphor, difficulty is heavy, so we wanted to see whether it is also unconsciously connected in our mind in both directions. And we kind of expected a robust association between the physical experience of weight and the experience of cognitive difficulty, especially in Croatian language, because we have a single word to denote both of these concepts. And so our subjects, university students, were asked to solve cognitive tasks of variable degree of difficulty while carrying backpacks of the same weight. And then afterwards, we asked them to assess the weight of their backpack. And our hypothesis was, of course, that the half of the subjects that solved more difficult tasks will also assess their backpack as heavier than the other half. And our hypothesis was confirmed. We also did this kind of fun exercises where we asked our participants, our colleagues at the Institute, to draw, build, and later explain abstract concepts to see maybe if we can get some new novel metaphors this way that we can also put into our database. And that was wonderful. I'm really thankful to all the participants, and by the end I will show you how really, really nice material we got from there. And then we have also applied some clinical research and tried to apply this theory that we have developed onto let's say, practical side, and to see whether we can contribute in this kind of research as well. So we have performed a research qualitative investigation of metaphor production by patients with schizophrenia to reveal conceptualization that underlies it and to detect possible errors. It was really, really interesting to do this research, and the results are also quite interesting because I think we definitely, as metaphor theorists, can contribute a lot to this really hard issue. And the results we have got are applicable in the developing standardized tests for detecting a schizophrenia, because we suggest that these tests should be completely different than they are at present. So the tangible results of our projects are lexical repository, semantic repository, and then conceptual repository. This means that we are not only giving lexemes and all those semantic cognitive primitives, frames, etc., but also conceptual links between them. And then we have also developed ontology within this project, and we have a lot of examples manually annotated for linguistic metaphors. And all this can serve as a prerequisite for automatic extraction and even interpretation of figurative language for many. Oh. okay, so what we have done is definitely applicable also for the artificial intelligence, because we know that for artificial intelligence, figurative language is quite a problem. And about future work, well, we have done everything we've done so far, mostly in Croatian language, and I think that the really full potential of this kind of approach would be if the project would become a multilingual. So we would really like to build this kind of multilingual figurative thought and language repository, and we have described some prerequisites in the book together with my colleagues Mariana Bolognesi and Mario Brdar, and we believe that building such a repository is really what we need to do at the moment as linguists, because as we have seen, the theory is really good that we have, and complemented with these other insights from other fields, I think it's really great. And now it's really time for us to build this kind of repository that would give us finally answers to really hard linguistic questions that I ask myself very often, like what are deep commonalities and possible universalities in human perception, cognition, and language, and what are fascinating cultural and linguistic differences. We are only speculating about all of this. So we have no real knowledge about what is truly universal, if anything, and what is not. And this kind of repository that gives us this full complexion from the most basic cognitive primitives and basic image schemas up to really, really developed metaphorical expressions could really give us an answer to it and opportunity to compare everything, etc. And then also how ideas and language arise from more simple cognitive units, etc. So these really basic questions need to be answered definitely. So by revealing all this, I think that we would finally also give an answer to a hard question, how meaning is constructed and how humans think and talk. And now I will just quickly show you this wonderful, for the end, these wonderful artifacts that were created by my colleagues. And I think that they really nicely represent the whole theory that I have presented, because obviously we knew everything about meaning somehow before. So we can see the really beautiful language that describes really metaphorical language. And here, for example, we have this novel metaphor of conceptualizing mind as a house, and this beautiful description of why she depicted it that way. Then we have some metonymies, quite obvious. Then this is also like an abstract concept depicted in an abstract way as well, but then really nicely described. What does it actually mean? And this is the neural theory of language and thought, I guess. This is a beautiful picture of mind. I like it. And this thinking is also quite interesting. I really like this one because this shows the unconsciousness of thinking, actually. So the theory is there because it happens there in the back and it's not visible from the front. So it's really nice. And this theory of thinking is also, I really liked it. It's kind of a rainbow with these strokes of brilliance, nice ideas that just like flash. So it's really nice. And this is perfect. This is a memory image that Wernicke was talking about. So that's it. This is also memory images, so kind of embodied simulation depicted nicely. This as well. Some metonymies again, as you can see, etc., etc. It's really nice. Then some conventional, like light bulb for idea, quite conventional metonymy, and unconventional way of conceptualizing idea, and that's it. Thank you.